Okay, so like I said, not a neurobiologist. This is very basic. But the our experience of stress comes from what we call the fight, flight, freeze response. And that is your body's natural response to danger, whether it's real danger or I don't want to necessarily say imagined danger. Maybe I would say perceived danger. And it's a type of stress response that helps you to react to threats to your life, to threats to your safety. Could be, like an oncoming car or a dog that you've encountered on your walk that's standing there baring its teeth, growling at you, right? So this fight, flight, freeze response sort of instantly causes some hormonal and physiological changes. And these changes are really important. They're really essential, and they allow you to act quickly so that you can protect yourself. So this is really a survival instinct that our ancient ancestors developed long, long, long ago, right? And so specifically, this fight, flight, freeze response is an active defense response where you're either fighting, like you are confronted with some sort of dangerous situation and you're able to sort of fight your way out of it. Or perhaps you very quickly realize like, nope, fighting isn't going to work. I'm going to tear out of here. I'm going to flee. And your heart rate gets faster. It increases oxygen flow to your muscles. Your pain perception drops, and your hearing and other senses sharpen. So these are all changes that are necessary and help you to act appropriately and rapidly in order to protect yourself when you encounter a dangerous situation. This neurobiology of stress is a really, really important process. And it's important to remember that this is a process that is designed to help to keep us safe. And it can also, in the modern world where we're not necessarily running from lions and tigers all day, and also where we're perceiving stress in ways that might be different, where we don't necessarily need to be saving ourselves. That's when sort of understanding this process and knowing what you can do about it can be really important. So the other thing that I thought would be helpful for us to do is make a distinction between stress and stressors. It's a very important distinction. So let's talk a little bit about what the difference is and why it's so important for us to know this. So a stressor is what activates the stress response in your body. So it's anything that you hear, smell, touch, taste, or even imagine could harm you. Remember before I was talking about like perceived danger. And there are external stressors. There are also internal stressors. Then distinguishing stressors from stress is the neurological and physiological shift that happens, what we were just talking about, right? That happens in your body and your brain and your nervous system when you encounter a stressor or a threat. And so, as I mentioned before, this is an evolutionary, adaptive response that really helps us to survive dangerous situations. So it's really important, but it's also important to distinguish the difference between stress and stressors, right? They're related. They relate to each other, but they're separate things. And again, I really want to emphasize that this response to this stress response to stressors is your nervous system doing its job to protect you from what it thinks is a threat. So this is not like, oh my gosh, what's what's wrong with my nervous system or my brain or my body? Like this, oftentimes we're in situations where somebody will say like, oh, just calm down, relax, right? Or you're in a situation where you find yourself stressed and you're like, what is going on? Why am I so stressed about this? This isn't that big of a deal, right? Like we often will sort of like minimize our stress or sort of have thoughts and judgments around it. But this is actually your nervous system working properly. This is your nervous system doing the job that it's supposed to do. So this is your body and your nervous system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But as I've sort of alluded to earlier, your nervous system has a hard time distinguishing between an actual threat to your life and to your safety and a perceived threat. Like, for instance, going on a job interview or doing a presentation in front of a large audience, right? I'm sure many of, if not most of us, have had that experience of like needing to speak in front of people or other things that make us feel stress. I heard, some of you, we were chatting a little bit before we got started. Some folks are kind of just starting their job search, maybe feeling a little bit stressed about that. Other folks are in a place in the curriculum that is really demanding, and that has created a stress response. So we're going to actually talk through some scenarios in a little bit that I hope will be helpful. So your nervous system has trouble distinguishing between like what is a real threat versus what is a perceived threat. And so if any sort of stressor is detected, that sort of overall general stress response is triggered, right? And so this is where we kind of run into a problem, is that once this response is triggered, again, like this is your body doing what it's supposed to do. What happens is that often, due to our modern day-to-day life, we're not able to complete this stress response in our body. And if we don't find a way to complete the stress response and discharge the stress, then your body holds on to it, which is not good for you. And often for those of us who have experienced this, which is many, if not everybody, if you're regularly experiencing stress responses, you're unable to complete those stress responses, and you're holding on to that stress in your body, that can lead to burnout. Has anybody here experienced burnout before? I certainly have. Yeah, I see some nodding. I see some hands raised. Yeah. Okay. Not fun, right? Like, wouldn't it be great to have a way to help ourselves prevent getting to that place, right? Or at the very least, if we, do get to that place, having a process and things that we can do to help pull ourselves out of that, because burnout is not fun. So before we kind of jump to the next slide, does anybody have any questions about sort of the stress response that we've talked through so far? Okay, cool. All right. So let's take the next step and talk about like, what can we do to help ourselves complete this stress cycle? And now the caveat that I want to give here is that this process is based on a fantastic book that I own because it's so fantastic, called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking Your Stress Cycle. The authors are Emily and Amelia Nagoski. They're actually twin sisters. It's a very interesting book, but this is an extremely helpful. There's a lot of extremely helpful things in their book, but this particular aspect of completing the stress cycle is a really, really important thing that they talk about in the book, and will be very, very useful for our conversation today. So there may be others, but there are seven ways that they outline that are great avenues to completing the stress cycle. We talked a little earlier about how your nervous system can't distinguish between like an actual threat versus a perceived threat. And so when we find ourselves in this stress cycle, right, when we have a stressor and our body triggers that stress response, and we know that we're feeling stressed, how can we help our nervous system to complete that cycle so that the stress can sort of be released from our bodies and from our nervous systems? Because typically, what would happen back in the day, right? In modern times, there aren't many opportunities to be running from a lion, but when there was a true legitimate stressor, and the stress response was invoked, you could release the stress by fighting and overcoming whatever that danger is, or successfully running away from it. I am not in any way promoting that you fight somebody in order to complete your stress response. I want to make that extremely clear. But to use that example, if you were being chased by a lion, what would you do? You'd run, right? You wouldn't stand there and go, let me try to fight this lion, right? You'd tear off and try to get as far away from the lion as fast as you could. And so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to know that the most efficient way to complete the stress cycle is to find a way to move your body, right? You can run, you can swim, you can dance, you can skip, whatever your favorite form of movement is. If you like to sweat it out in spin class, or if you've got a Peloton or a bike, anything that gets you breathing deeply, gets your heart pumping. They mention in the book that between like 20 and 60 minutes is on a daily basis is really something that is sort of optimal and very helpful here. So if you're somebody that is experiencing stress pretty regularly, which most of us are, particularly now, unfortunately, aiming to have some sort of regular physical exercise is really key and very helpful. That physical activity is what sends the signal to your nervous system that you've successfully survived whatever the threat is, and now you're safe and okay, right? Kind of makes sense. If you think about the being chased by a lion scenario, either you have some sort of weapon or tool that you use to fight and overcome the lion, or you run away and successfully escape, and then your body is able to see and recognize, okay, I've done what's needed to be done. I've escaped this danger, and now I'm safe and secure again. Okay, so physical activity is sort of like the number one thing, but we have other options, right? So what, and this is where our modern sort of living kind of comes into play, right? Like if you're standing up in front of an audience, you can't necessarily run, right? You have to, I guess you could. I'm sure some people do, right? It's just too much and they're like, I got to get out of here. But we're often in situations where this stress response is triggered and we can't necessarily immediately go get that physical activity, right? Or we may be, limited in some way in terms of our movement or what have you. So like I said, there are lots of other options.